Hey, what is up? My name is Rubidium, and today we're looking at this camera, the EVA1 from Panasonic. So the other week I was at my friendly neighborhood camera store, Hot Rod Cameras, checking out some gear, and I saw this camera. I was playing with it, told them the stuff I'm doing on YouTube, and they agreed to let me borrow the camera to review, to check out, and basically get my head around, which was incredibly nice of them. Check them out. I'll put the link in the description. So I own a Canon C200B. I've made a lot of videos about it. A comment I get very often is how it compares to the EVA1, because cameras came out at a similar time. They're in the same sort of price range. They're Panasonic versus Canon. And a lot of people, are looking to get into the cinema camera market and are kind of like, tossing up between these two cameras. So today I'm going to break down this camera, what it's good for, what it's not as good for, and see if I can offer some guidance to people who are in the market for a camera like this and thinking about the EVA1. So the sub $10,000 cinema camera is the new niche. People that shoot documentary, that shoot weddings, that shoot low budget cinema are all looking for something that does everything. And Panasonic, Canon, Sony, and Blackmagic have all entered cameras into this space. I think with the technology that everyone has access to, every camera, you have to cut corners. No one's able to deliver a fully featured cinema camera under $10,000. Each one of the manufacturers and each one of the cameras has cut a corner somewhere to try and get the camera under this price. So essentially, if you're looking for a sub $10,000 cinema camera, you kind of have to pick pick the feature that you can most do without. First things first, the form factor. This is a very light camera. I might even be tempted to say too light. The body's probably around the same size as the C200, but it feels like it contains a lot more plastic than metal. Once I took the lens off and picked it up, I was kind of shocked. It seems like the materials that they used are really great. It just doesn't have much weight in the hand. It does have a lot of these great quarter 20 mounting holes in the top. It has 6 of them. You can move the handle around. You can mount other things off them. The C200 doesn't have this. Everyone else, most of the other things need a plate to do this, which brings us to the screen, which is bright, is usable. It's a touch screen. It's a very interesting. It has this cool pop out, almost sort of like a lens hood that you can almost use as a viewfinder. But in my personal opinion, for my use, it's too small. It's approximately the same size as my 5D Mark III camera. A monitor this size, even though it works great and looks great, it's a little bit too small for real world operations. Like the C200, the EVA has all these customizable buttons on the side. So if you end up using one-touch autofocus a lot, or you end up using auto exposure, auto white balance a lot, you can program it into one of these buttons. They don't glow in the dark like the RELXs or the C700 buttons do for operating on set. They're just painted with a nice white paint. There's a kind of cool color scheme, and you're able to get to know them pretty quickly. It has dual XLR in, it has manual audio controls, so if you're interviewing someone and they start to get a little bit excited, without going into the menus of the camera, you can turn down the audio so that you don't peak. So that was kind of the housekeeping. Let's get into what makes this camera special. It has dual native ISO. It has 800 and 2500. The camera native ISO, you typically get the most dynamic range, 13 or 14 or 15 stops depending on the camera. So with the Canon cameras, as you go away from their ISO 800, you tend to get less dynamic range. So for low light work, Panasonic has solved this by having 2 ISOs, an 800 and a 2500. So if you're doing low light work, you can jack the native ISO up to 2500 and hopefully get a lot better dynamic range in darker areas. This camera also has a retractable IR cut filter. Now, infrared radiation is what we get from the sun, and it comes into the camera sensor and throws all kind of distortion. So almost every camera has an IR cut filter built into the sensor. What this camera can do is remove it digitally, and it works like the 2, 4, or 6 stops of ND. It's a little shutter that drops down in front of the sensor. So if you're shooting at night out of daylight, you can take it off, get a little bit more range, and get all kinds of cool effects. I'm gonna have to test this to sort of see what I can get. I expect that I'll be able to get brighter shots at night, and also kind of, a little bit of a psychedelic feel. So this camera does up to 240 frames per second in 2K or HD, but it crops in on the sensor, so you get, like a lot of cameras do, you get the middle of your image, not the entire frame. I have to say, this is where the C200 really falls down. Their MPEG-4 full frame slow motion really looks really compressed and really doesn't look great. The EVA does have nice and clean slow motion at those higher frame rates, even higher than the C200, and it's a lot cleaner from what I've seen. It seems to be a much better solution for slow motion. So let's talk about the core of this camera, and the big advantage of it is that it shoots 4K 10-bit 422. That's what television studios expect their footage to be shot in. That's a broadcast standard. The other advantage of that is that it's like the C-Log 2 or 3 in the Canon. This camera has V-Log, which gives a very flat image and the most dynamic range, but it's able to put that in a place that's much more gradable than the 420 the C200 shoots. It also shoots this 422 10-bit to SD cards, which are cheap, which are plentiful, which store a lot of this footage, and you're able to pretty much buy them anywhere. You do need faster SD cards than typical because the bit rates are so high, but the EVA1 hasn't gone over to the CFast standard, where you have this larger media to incorporate RAW that is really expensive and kind of hard to get right now. This camera has a 5.7K sensor that it captures an image in 5.7K and then down reses it to 4K for capture. An advantage of this is the camera features electric image stabilization, or EIS, which means sort of like your iPhone, it can track someone's movement, the movement of the camera, and stabilize the footage as it's recording it onto the SD card. So for handheld camera work, you get a lot more stability. Yeah, you get a lot smoother image. It takes out the small jitters and shakes. If you're also using a lens that has optical image stabilization, it's the best of both worlds, and you can get a really smooth, usable handheld image off this camera. Let's talk price. This camera retails for around $7,300 US. That's around the same cost of the Canon C200. That's more than $2,000 more expensive than the Blackmagic Ursa Mini, and $1,000 more expensive than the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro. This camera only comes in the version with the monitor. It doesn't have a comparable configuration like the Canon C200B, which I own, which is only $6,000 US. So for the cost of the EVA1, you can do what I did, which is buy the C200B, buy an external monitor, buy a lens, buy a whole bunch of other parts for the same price as just the EVA1 body. So of the digital cinema cameras under $10,000, the EVA1 is the most expensive on the market. The other huge elephant in the room of this camera is its lack of continuous autofocus. It does have one touch autofocus, but it's not continuous. It can't keep focusing like the C200 does. The reason that the lights behind me aren't as bokeh out as they are in my C200 videos is I can't really go below f3 or else I'm not going to be able to keep my face in focus. On the C200, I can go all the way down to 1.4 with a very, very shallow depth of field, and the camera will track my face as I'm moving around and talking. That for me is a key feature of the C200 and actually makes it really useful for documentary stuff. That EVA1 doesn't have that. It has stabilization instead. Remember what I said at the start about everyone who makes digital cinema cameras for under $10,000 having to cut something to save costs and make the price point. Well, the EVA1 has cut RAW. It does not record into RAW internally. We're told that it will at a future point, with a future firmware update, output RAW to an external device. So if you have an Atomos or a small HD, or you have an external monitor or device that captures RAW, then you can use this camera to shoot RAW. But right now, it's not able to do that. I'm a huge proponent of RAW. I like shooting RAW. RAW works for what I do, but it's not for everyone. The file sizes are huge. It requires a lot more post-production, and for most people and most uses, the 10-bit 422 is going to be more than enough. So who is this camera for? If your main work is documentary, if it's working away from the studio, away from controlled lighting situations, away from power and support and DITs, if your main work is weddings, like it is for a lot of people, or events, this is definitely a camera worth checking out, because you can get hours of footage onto the dual SD cards that are in the back of the camera. You can have pre-graded footage that you're able just to hand to the client with some of the scenes that Panasonic has built in. If you're shooting news for television, or you're shooting clips that you want to sell for stock footage, this is a great camera to have. You get a heap of power out of the batteries that come with it. The batteries are cheap. The cards are cheap. The 422 4K 10-bit has more than enough information for most people. The dynamic range is great. All in all, it's like a killer camera. If you are heavily processing the images that you make, if you're doing a lot of post-production, if you're doing blue screen or visual effects, then RAW might be important for you. And even though this camera will do RAW, right now the C200 records RAW into the camera, which this camera never will. I think that a lot of these camera debates that people have over which is better, which is not, is essentially kind of a waste of time. I read a great book years ago about Lexus, when Toyota decided to develop a luxury brand and make luxury vehicles. A lot of people were confused, and they asked the head of the brand, what are you thinking competing with Mercedes, competing with BMW? You know, these guys have been doing it for 70, 80 years. They own the luxury brand. Like, what chance do you have of like pushing your way in there? The guy from Toyota said, we're not looking to take people away from Mercedes or BMW. We're looking for the people that grew up driving a Corolla and then had a family and bought a Camry and are now older and want something nicer. They don't want to go from their Camry into a BMW. They don't like the way those cars feel. They want basically a Camry with leather seats, with a bigger engine and all kinds of gadgets. That's why Toyota made the Lexus brand and why it succeeded so well, because those baby boomers that had driven Toyota their whole life and were comfortable with Toyota wanted something bigger. The reason that the Canon cinema cameras did so well, especially the C100 and C300 when they launched, even though they didn't have nearly the features of the Red or the La'ari, was that a lot of photographers that were comfortable shooting Canon went across to the C300 because they understood the Canon ecosystem. That for me explains a lot of the camera debate. If you're a Canon shooter, you're comfortable with Canon, you like the Canon science, then you're probably going to be more happy with a Canon cinema camera than you are with a Blackmagic or a Sony or a Panasonic. But if you got into filmmaking, shooting on the GH4 and GH5s like a lot of people did, the Panasonic image is what you want, then you're going to be much more happy with this camera than you are with a Canon camera. If you're a DP who shoots on the VariCam system and typically hires cameras, but you want to own one, you can get this camera and get almost the same image for a much smaller price. So that's my take on the EVA1. Like I said, hot rod cameras in Burbank lent me this. Please check them out. I'll continue to do these reviews. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about what their experience was of either owning the EVA1 or renting it or shooting with it. All in all, it's an awesome camera, huge step up from the GH5. for Panasonic owners. Very attractive alternative for people who will shoot broadcast documentary or weddings from the C200. But time will tell which camera kind of gets its claws into the broadcast market. That's my review. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you next time.